Greetings, everyone. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another episode of In the Prog Seat. It's Tuesday night. Thanks for joining us, everybody. We are returning to the album study format tonight, and today is going to be a George LeMay night. But let me introduce everybody before we start introducing the crew and the album in question today. So we've got all the way from Chicago, like I mentioned, Mr. George LeMay. We got Ken Golden, the professor of prog from New Jersey, Eric Porter, upstate New York, Chad Hutchinson, our center square from Pennsylvania, my good friend from the Bronx, Chuck Alvarez, and the other half of our Twin Towers of Chicago, Mr. Louis Nasser, and special friend.
Pablo Garcia from Zona Sombra, for anybody who has ever heard the old records.
Welcome.
Visiting. Yeah, man.
Good to have you. So you may have remembered just recently we did a show where Chuck was the ringleader. He picked our album study and then named his successor for the next episode. So that would be George. So George has given us a very cool album to re-listen to or listen to for the first time. And we're going to talk about it. We're going to pick it apart. That album is 1977's War Dance by Coliseum II. So for those of you who maybe not familiar with Coliseum II, and I'll kind of let George go a little bit more in depth on this, this is the second band kind of put together by John Heisman. The first was just called Coliseum. This is Coliseum II, a little bit different lineup, kind of like Electric Band 2, wouldn't you say, George?
Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit. I would argue that, and I'm a fan of the first Coliseum lineup, but I would argue that this is the more exciting Coliseum. It's different, certainly. I'll let George tell us who's in the band and kind of kick off this episode, and I'll turn it over to George.
All right. Well, the history of this band can be encapsulated in 4 years. It basically ran from 75 to 78. Following the demise of Tempest, drummer John Heisman forms this band in early 75 with Gary Moore initially. They add Don Airey on keyboards, Mike Starr on vocals, and Neil Murray on bass. 1976, they released their first album, Strange New Flesh, which is more similar to the early Coliseum. There's one instrumental that kicks off the album, completely rips. You got to at least track that track down. But after this album, it didn't sell well. It was basically a flop. Neil Murray leaves. They can Mike Starr, and they decided to go full-fledged jazz rock. January of 77, they released Electric Savage. And they follow that up with War Dance in November of 77. Also, towards the tail end of 77, they take part in Andrew Lloyd Webber's Variations, which is band interpretations of Paganini works. That actually went to number 2 on the charts in early 1978, if you can believe that. It all came to an end in 78, though, at the end of the year. Moore goes back to Thin Lizzy at the end of the summer. Don Airey goes to Rainbow and at the very end of the year. I do have a boot from October 78 where there's a new track on it, and I've heard that there are 3 or 4 demo tracks out there. I've never seen them, or I would have grabbed them. But basically, by the end of 1978, the band is over.
Hey, George, does that bootleg have Keith Airey playing guitar on it?
It doesn't. So possibly Moore was just available for a couple of gigs, or I'm not quite sure how that shook out, but it is Gary Moore on there.
George, it's one of the things Pete and I had talked about privately, that Duncan Mackay was in the band playing keyboards. And I don't know. He never said when. I don't know if it's before.
Yeah. He was. Well, I read that he was considered for the band, but he wasn't actually in.
Yeah.
Could be semantics there.
Yeah,
maybe. Is the Neil Murray that you're talking about the same guy that played with Sabbath?
Yeah, Whitesnake.
Whitesnake.
All right.
National Health.
National Health.
But anyway, the record at hand is Coliseum II, War Dance. Kind of a cool cover, actually. A little weird, but
I think so, yeah.
It's been reissued many times, originally on MCA. I like to kick. Nobody ever starts with Pete. I want to start with Pete. You're a Jeff Beck guy. Do you not hear? I never see anybody say it, but do you not hear Jeff Beck on a couple of tracks? I'm thinking Fighting Talk, and jamming section of major keys.
Mhm.
Is it just me?
It's funny you said that, George, because I will read you my description, because what I do for these shows is I go and re-listen to these albums and I take notes on all the songs. So exactly what it says for Fighting Talk. It says Gary Moore unleashed and doing his Jeff Beck thing here. Fans of Wired will love this song. Airy keeps up with him on his synth every step of the way, as if it's Beck and Jan Hammer all over again. I'm reading it to you verbatim. For sure.
Review albums.
But don't you think it's more? I'm sorry. Don't you think it's more because of Don Airy than Gary Moore? I hear the similarities, but he's playing the mini mode, and he's doing that Max Middleton, Jan Hammer thing. That's
whole track.
That song's written by Moore and Heisman.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, even the intro I thought was like freeway jamish, right? I mean, that way it kind of starts off. That's where I got tipped off on that too.
Yeah, I mean, I hear a lot of Wired era Jeff Beck on here, but I also hear some RTF on here as well.
Most
For me,
definitely.
this whole album is kind of, for me, it's like Return to Forever meets Beck from that period.
Mhm.
And I'm okay with that because I don't know. I think I was talking to Eric. We were at the Total concert the other night. We were having a beer before the show, and we were discussing this briefly. And to me, this is one of the unsung fusion albums of this era. That again, it came late, right? Because the fusion heyday was already kind of done. And I think it's a travesty that more people who are fusion fans don't cite this album often enough as the great album that it is.
Chuck, what say you?
Oh man. Well, once again, I'm a big fan of Coliseum. I was a big fan of their earlier first incarnation. This album, that fits in very well with everything that was going on with the early to mid 70s fusion jazz bands of that time. I did hear a lot of Return Forever on this group, and also heard a lot of Jeff Beck as well, especially with the songs that were mentioned earlier. We tend to forget how Gary Moore, we tend to think of him as this metal, sometimes blues guitarist, but he holds his own with this band. You get to hear how talented of a guitarist that he was. All throughout this entire album, you heard him blazing on here. But the one that I always think of this Coliseum as Return to Forever but with having perhaps Billy Cobham as a drummer instead. That's how I usually think about it, because people tend to forget how great of a drummer John Heisman was. John Heisman was as great as anybody during the 60s and could be up there with anybody during the 70s of his time. And I've always loved this album. It's always been my favorite from the band. I always was just shocked that it was never mentioned as one of those great fusion albums, but then perhaps that it happened to come along after Return to Forever had all their greatness, and Mahavishnu Orchestra with the two incarnations that they had, and Weather Report or Herbie Hancock. So people tend to forget how great this album was and this band was. Sadly they just didn't have that full power that could have struck them forward. But there's some killer songs on here. The title track, War Dance, starts off the album. You think you're listening to a Jeff Beck album. Which of major keys is quite playful. Put it that way is typical Return to Forever, but they have like this English flair to it. And even Castles, people tend to think of Castle as one of those songs, but it's an okay song, But then it goes right back to power fusion again with the Fighting Talk, the Inquisition. Star Maiden, Mysterio, and Quasar is a bit weak at times, and so I just wish that that it could have developed a little bit more than it did. And then the album just ends with Last Exit, just another great song. To me, I think this is a great album. Love it.
Well, we got two newbies on this one. Let's hear from Chad. This was a new to you album, right?
Yeah, Coliseum and Coliseum II were always bands that I meant to check out and just never did for whatever reason. So that said, I'm very glad you picked this and forced me to finally do it. I liked it on the first listen. Actually, after the first listen, I ran out and I bought the 2-for-1 disc, which is great. It's nice to have these two albums. Yeah, I enjoyed it a lot. Like you guys are saying, there's some RTF on here. There's Beck. Sometimes when they get really ripping, I kind of felt like I almost heard a little bit of a Finch flare every once in a while. That might be a stretch, but I wasn't as familiar with Gary Moore's guitar playing, but he is really versatile. He goes from everywhere from like a Hackett-esque type melody to being Al Di Meola. Specifically, I thought the Misterioso section of the suite near the end really sounded a lot like Al Di Meola. I want to say I listened to this album 7, 8, 9 times, but I can't. That is not technically true because I skipped Castles almost every time. I think the first time I listened to it, I was like, "Hey, this is pretty good." I put it in our chat, and then it got to track 4, and I said, "George, what the hell is this?" And you're like, "Yeah, I know." So yeah, I sat through Castles maybe 1.5 times, and it should have been left off. It's not good. It's like what did I think of earlier? It's like Happy the Man decided to go yacht rock and not in a good way. I just think it's terrible. It's a horrible song. It's not, and it's even worse than River, which is on the Electric Savage. But I like both of the albums a lot. I think this one is much more upbeat. It rips much more often. That's not to take anything away from Electric Savage, but there's some slower tempos on that. There's a little spaciness here and there. And I even went back and listened to the first one, and while Mike Starr's voice isn't bad whatsoever, it just felt like they were having to force time into the songs for him to sing. Because as soon as he stopped singing, they would just take off and they would just go nuts. Don Airey and Gary Moore would just go crazy. Yeah, there's not a song on this I don't like. I mean, put Castles aside, every one of these songs I like. I did find some of Don Airey's keyboards, not necessarily his sounds, because synths were coming in and all that, but some of his melodies are kind of quirky and playful and a little odd, but I ended up really liking them. The one that really sticks out is in Major Keys. That's a goofy melody, but it's fun. And there's some great call and response that he does with himself there with the synth and the organ. It starts off a lot like the Crunge from Led Zeppelin. I mean, when I first heard that, I was with the funky guitar and the bass line. I was like, wow, that is the Crunge. But then it moves on to the crazy keyboard melody, and it's all forgotten. So yeah, I would say this, like Chuck said, this is one of those Fusion albums that Fusion fans need to have. This is really great stuff. It's a shame it came mid-70s when there wasn't a lot of appetite for it anymore. Punk was taking over and people didn't want to hear this stuff so much anymore. RTF and Mahavishnu, been there, done that for the general public. But this is a phenomenal album. Highly recommended to any Fusion fan. And I would say the same thing for Electric Savage.
Yep.
So excellent choice, George. I'm in.
The Castle is an interesting track because, yeah, it's bad. I normally like Gary's vocals quite a bit. Like, I thought his voice developed really nicely in the 80s, but he's like trying way too hard to be this like kind of like melodic crooner on this, and it just does not work at all. It's like
kind of like Michael Henderson, a bad copy.
Yeah. No
At this, on this version, that is, because he's developed as a singer. He had developed as a singer.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Well, let me go to Ken because I want to know, did you hear this contemporaneously? You heard it in time, or you caught up to it some years later?
Oh, no, I didn't buy it in 1977, 1980, maybe, I mean, it's been in my collection forever. Actually, it's kind of funny because I never was really familiar with Colosseum. So I've had the Coliseum II albums forever. And it's only recently, like I say recently, last 10 years or so where I sort of dabbled a little bit in Coliseum. And if anybody that has a Valentine suite, just check this album out because it's
superb.
Brilliant album. I was in a record store, Double Decker Records in Allentown, best record store in the country. And I'm like, what the hell are they playing? This is amazing. It was Coliseum. It was Valentine's Suite. I bought it. So I have I hadn't listened to it in a long time, and I spent a lot of time listening to it in the past couple of weeks. I've taken a slightly different approach on it. First of all, it's a brilliant album, right? I mean, and it was an inspired pick, George. So, I mean, really great record. I have nothing bad to say about it other than Castles. But I don't hear it so much as a fusion album. To me, clearly Return to Forever is an influence on the band. I mean, that's undeniable.
Mm-hmm.
I hear this more as a prog rock record than I do as a jazz rock fusion album. Gary Moore, he's a blues player. He never played jazz in his life, before, during, and after. The guy's a fire-breathing monster. I mean, he's just like one of the most incredible guitarists on the planet. The guy could do anything. So like when Chad was making references to Al Di Meola, yeah, he could play fast like Al Di Meola.
Mm-hmm.
I don't hear him sounding quite like Al Di Meola. I think he's versatile. I think he's able, and he was adaptable to the music, but I don't see Gary Moore as a jazz player, as a fusion player. You know, listen to him play on this album. He's playing with so much distortion throughout the album. These guys don't, most fusion players don't play like that. They're playing very clean, and I just hear it a little differently. So I'm not saying that, Return to Forever isn't a strong influence. It's clearly there. But I think for my taste, my perception, I should say, listening to it, I see it veer more towards the prog rock side. It's an interesting band. I think John Moll, nobody talks about John Moll, the bass player.
Great bass player. Mm-hmm.
Really good. He did nothing before. He did nothing after. He was completely unknown. I don't know where he came from.
Just recently
John
passed
Heisman
away.
must have owed him money or something. I don't know.
He just died, I guess. Yeah.
He just recently passed away like 6 months ago.
Yeah. Don Airey himself was kind of unknown. His career started after Coliseum II, playing on Rainbow and obviously now he's in Deep Purple, great versatile keyboard player. But yeah, Gary Moore, he started with Skid Row. He had his solo career. And then afterwards, to me, he's a blues player, so very adaptable. And so anyway, that's my take on, and John Heisman, he's a phenomenal drummer, guy who never really gets mentioned. Mm-hmm. And he started out playing jazz, but also playing blues, played with John Mayall, Blues Breakers. And and then actually after Coliseum II, his wife was Barbara Thompson. He kind of went off into the jazz world. So and then Coliseum, he reformed Coliseum with Dick Hextall-Smith. So he kind of dabbled. He was very versatile, great player. So is it okay if I just run through? I'll just do a quick run through on my take on the album. Yeah. So I just said everyone in the album, they're playing their ass off. I mean, it's just Moore's fingers are on fire from the whole album. War Dance blazing from the get-go. Major keys, really kind of upbeat, kind of nice. Put It That Way, I said Moore's off to the races. Aries follows his lead, really good back and forth soloing. That's where I'm hearing, like Pete saying, like Wired. I'm hearing that Jan Hammer, Jeff Beck, so to speak. But for me, you guys are guitar player. Pete, you're a guitarist. Eric, you're a guitarist. I don't hear the Jeff Beck comparison so much. Conceptually, I understand it, but
yeah, I mean, he doesn't,
not literally.
He doesn't play like Beck, but but there is a similar type.
Yes, that back and forth, that Jan Hammer, Jeff Beck, Mini Moog guitar, back and forth, trading licks. I mean, earlier today, I sent you guys a link to this Secret Oyster video of them doing Paella from Old Grey Whistle Test. I don't know if you watched it, but it was the same kind of thing. Kenneth Knudsen on the Mini Moog, and Klaus Bolling on guitar on the Les Paul, and the two of them going back and forth. You know, that's 1975, 1976. That's blow by blow wire. That's what, you know, that's what was going on, and that's what these guys were doing. So,
and to your point, Ken, I mean, Jeff Beck isn't a jazz player either.
No,
he's a blues and rock guy, right? Yeah,
he was a blues rock guy. But the thing with Beck is Beck was always into trying new things, right? He was always looking to innovate, and clearly that was an area of interest to him, and he dove into it. And he was so talented. I mean, the thing about Jeff Beck was he was always learning. You know, what he was doing in the last 10 years of his life was totally different from what he was doing in the first 10 years of his life. Yeah. You know, in terms of technique, and you know, he was fanatical, right?
Always clean, man.
Yeah. So the album is like, so here's the other thing I was thinking of. This album, it's a worse listen on CD than it is on vinyl, because Castles is the last track on the first side. So you could just, you know, you could end that side early, you know. But when you're listening to
right in the middle.
But when you're listening to the CD, it's a fucking roadblock, you know. So what I wrote, I said awful, more singing, and he was never much of a vocalist. He brings the album to a grinding halt. There must have been some kind of deal worked out in advance that Moore was allowed to sing. Either that or Heisman owed him a lot of money. And then, you know, I mentioned this same thing, you know, saying about it's a better listen on vinyl.
Well, they had their record company had some say in getting rid of Mike Starr and Neil Murray. Maybe they said, "Hey, you got to have one vocal track, so we'll try to get you on the radio." Who knows?
No, but it wasn't that track, that's for sure.
Oh no.
You know. So basically, side two, they're starting from scratch with Fighting Talk, and then they're off to the races again. You know, and the whole album, it's this crazy soloing from those guys, and really, we don't mention Heisman enough because his playing is just brilliant on this album. Yeah. He's an octopus. I mean, he's you know, he's great.
Oh, he was a great drummer, man.
Yeah, Inquisition has a nice, like, a light Spanish flavor, reminding me a little bit of Iceberg, just a little bit. And then you have the 3-part Star Maiden Mysterioso Quasar. It starts out kind of mellow, and then All Hell Breaks Loose, and then it kind of mellows out a bit. And then Last Exit, I thought it was just like it was a solid closing piece. It just you know, it just picked up the energy. It just had that energy that the whole album conveyed. And yeah, I mean, definitely, yeah, a jazz rock album, but to me, more of a prog rock record. So if I wouldn't argue the case too strongly.
So you would call it a prog fusion album?
Okay.
Like they would usually
Chuck
call.
just invented a new category, prog fusion.
That's what they usually call a romantic warrior.
Chuck, I hate you now. I'm gonna have to rework my whole collection. You know, I'll be up all night. But that's true. You know, and that's the thing. You know, like, for example, you know, romantic warrior is, I think, the obvious reference point for this record, and it's interesting because that album was a big influence on Relayer, and at the same time, you know, Yes was a big influence on Return to Forever. So you know, there's that you're getting that cross pollination. So yeah, and I think this is kind of the embodiment of it. And you know, 1976, 77. I mean, yeah, I guess it all kind of died right around then, right? So.
Speaking of track sequence, might you flip-flop War Dance and put it that way? It seems to me like Put It That Way makes for a good opener.
But that was, yeah, I mean,
I would agree.
That would mirror Electric Savage, because that starts off with Put It This Way.
Yeah.
That's not to say it's good or bad, but that could be cool.
Well, let's go to our other newbie, Mr. Porter.
Wait, one other thing, we don't know, but I almost wonder if these two albums weren't recorded in the same sessions.
They weren't.
Nope.
They say when Electric Savage was recorded, but they don't give any information of when War Dance was recorded.
I never noticed.
No, I don't think that was recorded. I think it was recorded like a year later, if I'm not mistaken.
They came out the same year. They
Same
both
year,
came out
no.
in 77. And Electric Savage, it even says that it was recorded winter 76, 77. So when would they have had time to do this? So I wouldn't.
Late summer 77 is when they recorded it.
Well,
Close.
maybe in the liner notes, maybe it said that. I don't know. But
Yeah, that's what it says in the booklet with the
there you go.
I'm not making it up, I promise.
All right.
But and Ken too may not necessarily be recording as much as maybe the whole thing was written.
Yeah.
You know, hey, we'll save these for the next one, and you know, probably obviously written fairly close together.
They went through a real creative spell.
Well, Eric, you're the other newbie. You almost got this album like 6 months ago. This was going to be in our 4 Fusion show for 77, but we swapped it out at the last minute. I'm guessing you appreciate that acoustic solo in the Inquisition, because that is pretty hot stuff.
Not only that, I love the ending. That ending is fire.
Yep.
But yeah, I like the and it's funny because I went out and watched I found a Sight and Sound show, and he brought out, he had the Ovation acoustic back then, whatever, 76, 77, playing that, and that was pretty impressive. But yeah, that's one of I had kind of labeled tracks. I had Fighting Talk. The Inquisition was one of my other favorite tracks. I'm kind of sitting in the same spot as everyone else. Get Castles out of there, and this thing pretty much burns from start to finish. But Don Airey to me was a huge, and I don't say this to demean him. What a huge surprise that was to me. I mean, he's playing his ass off too, and I'm not sure. I've heard his stuff, and I mean, I remember seeing he played with Ozzy, I think, for a while live and stuff. I don't know why, but I was, as much as and Gary Moore, like you guys said, Heisman is fantastic. Don Airey killed me on this. I thought he was great, and he keeps up. The pace is there all the way through. Those guys smoke from start to finish. So he was very impressive on this record, I thought, as well.
Eric, you should check out his solo albums. Don Airey solo albums. Some of them very good. He had one called K2. That was really, really good. And it's on CD. And even, you know, he's on he's on Ear. He's put out some very nice, you know, hard rock, deep purplish kind of thing, you know, kind of versatile. It's good, cool. Worth exploring.
He didn't do anything like this though, did he?
No.
And I actually purposely did not listen to Electric Savage because I hadn't heard this record, and I just wanted to make sure I was focusing on War Dance, and I listened to it a couple times a day. But great stuff. And like you said, that acoustic stuff, I would have liked to hear more of that too. Terrific. But yeah, blown away. And I agree kind of what everyone said. This is something I feel like, again, I don't know how or why I missed it. Kind of the same story as Chad. Had heard of them, but for some reason never picked anything up. But it fits right into the category of what everyone's talking about with the Beck and Return to Forever. It slots right in as it's a good fit as far as I can hear to that era and the bands of that era. It's great stuff.
Did you ever listen much to Gary Moore's solo stuff, Eric?
I have some of his early 80s stuff, and when he really got kind of into the bluesy stuff, that, I mean, I liked it, but it wasn't anything that I picked up. Some of his 80s, like Corridors of Power, I have on LP still, and some of that 80s stuff I have of Gary's.
Cool. He's got a lot of albums.
My path in was my best friend is a big Gary Moore guy like Pete, and he came about the information that he had done jazz rock records, and he went and got it, I'm going to say like 85 or so, and brought it all around us, and we were all like, wow, you know.
Yeah. George, I had asked Pete when we met up at the show, have you ever read anything about Gary Moore talking about this period of his career? But because I was trying to find something, obviously he shifted, he went more hard rock, then went really blues. And a lot of times people do that and they'll kind of disparage the fusion stuff or whatever. I just wondered what he thought of this, because I'd love to have heard more of him in this vein, because he's just fire on here.
Never seen him reference it at all.
Okay.
Nope.
The only thing I saw I could find was in the same liner notes that he had very good things to say about John Heisman, not only as a drummer, but how he challenged him and pretty much, set him on the straight as being a professional musician. And he also commented how challenging this music was. They'd come off stage and he'd have a headache because he was concentrating so hard.
Am I the only one who actually saw Gary Moore play?
I
Yeah,
saw
you're the
once.
oldest one.
Once.
You saw him?
I said you're the oldest one, of course.
Yeah, I saw him. I saw him with Greg Lake.
Oh, you didn't see him with Thin Lizzy?
I never saw. I was never a Thin Lizzy fan. Never.
Shame.
Just all I knew was Boys Are Back in Town. I mean, that's all. Whiskey in a jar. That's about it.
That's painful to hear.
Yeah.
I know, right?
But I had read that Gary Moore had actually wanted to take Steve Hackett's spot briefly in Genesis, because he was a big fan of Foxtrot, a big fan of Genesis, earlier period, and he actually considered just auditioning for them. And then when Mike Rutherford heard about that, like about 6 years later, he was shocked. He didn't even know that Gary Moore even knew of Genesis. That's so that would have been very odd right there.
Yeah, I love Gary. I don't know if that would have worked though.
No, not at all. Not at all.
I think there would have been a personality clash there also.
Yeah,
boy.
probably.
Oh, Tony Banks would have loved him.
Tony Banks would have killed him, or vice versa.
Right around the same time is when Moore, Pete could tell us best. He had the solo album with Flight of the Snow Moose, and I think there's another track or two that's kind of in this vein.
Yeah.
Out in the streets.
He also guested on the Gary Boyle stuff. That's pretty much just like this.
Yeah. Yeah.
So he definitely had an interest in it for a while, but I don't know.
Out in the Streets and Dirty Fingers. There's some really good fusion-y stuff on those couple albums. The ones that came right before Corridors of Power. Those are good. Those are good.
You ever hear? Was it Grinding Stone?
Yeah, that's good too. Yeah.
That's early.
Yeah.
Well, what about you, Lewis? When did you come upon this stuff?
I bought this record back when I lived in Maryland. I forget why I picked it up. I was just showing Pablo that my booklet, if you want to call it that, is just a shitty piece of cardboard with somebody. I hope these are coffee stains and not some other body fluid. I can't really be sure. But basically, that's all I have, and I've had it for a long time. I love Gary Moore. I think the guy was an incredible talent with that Les Paul, and then later, to my way of thinking, Gary Moore was always just a little bit behind where he should have been. He was always trying to be like, he was a little late with his metal era. He was a little late with his fusion era. He tried to do the blues thing. He just never, ever caught fire, in spite of his immense talent. I'm not sure why that was. But I love this playing. I always knew of Don Airey from Ozzy, because I grew up listening to metal. And then when I saw it was the same Don Airey, I was like, holy shit, like this guy can actually do more than pads, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like he can do more than the intro to Mr. Crowley. That was a revelation, right? And I think Ken mentioned it, but it has to be said. Some of these songs are structured. Okay, let me say one thing. I think this record is great, but I'm going to be a little bit less generous than you guys have been. I think that this record has everything that is awesome, but also everything that is shitty about fusion. So what do I mean by that? I mean that some of these songs are not actual songs. They're bits glued together. Let me be very concrete. The intro song, it begins, it starts great, then suddenly it transitions very weirdly into like Papa Smurf's orgy brass synth section, and then the song starts with a pulse. And there are transitions that are a little bit jagged, musically speaking. Everything is awesome, but as a story, I find it strange sometimes. The shorter songs work better, and then you can hear things. We already talked about Cat, but I think this record has the other dilemma of a lot of these albums, which was that there were producers trying to make something commercial happen. And then they try super hard. Not only do they have a ballad, but they slather it with reverb they make it really obvious. This is where you have to sort of stop what you're doing and try to make out, even with yourself in front of the fucking mirror. It's just stupid. So I hate that aspect of it. Another thing that I don't like, this is just as a bass player speaking, in a lot of fusion records, there's a tendency that whenever the bass has a feature, there's a formula. Everybody slows down, they play chords, and the bass has to have a lot of chorus, a little bit of an octave pedal, the compressor right up, and it's like a David Gilmour solo on bass. And this guy can play. So I refer to Star Maiden. That is that format, right? And, you know, I have played on records where I've been required to do that, and it pisses me off because the bass can do a lot more than just that thing. So, but other than that, I think that this record is really great. And I would agree with Ken. To me, most of it is really just like a pretty rockin', it's prog rock that actually rocks. Mm-hmm. And that is in no small measure due to just how everybody plays their parts, because they're not taking shortcuts. And John Heisman's drum parts are very, very idiosyncratic. They're very different. If you give this to another kind of a more rock drummer, I don't think that they would have sounded like that. Mm-hmm. The only person I think would have been interesting just as an experiment, I would like to hear what this music would sound like with a guy like Stuart Copeland on drums. That guy's got power, and that guy understands syncopation, and he can do some cool shit. But other than that, I mean, Inquisition is great. Quasar, again, just I can't help it. I'm just going to nerd out a little bit. As a physicist, I expect a Quasar something that has more of a pulse, right? I would expect it to have a lot of tremolo, a lot of other things. Even electroharmonics, their pulsar, their quick.
Awesome.
The nerd froze.
Luis's friend is looking at him like,
well, I wanted to
love
pop
in his eyes, like, my friend is so smart.
Pretty good.
He's back.
you froze.
Well, I was bitching about things, so we can continue the stream of bitching. I was just saying major keys is not usually my thing in general in music, but this one is pretty good. It's a pretty good tune, right? It's unusual, and it's saved by the drummer, actually. The drum part is what makes it, in my opinion. It's really good. So, but then once they do put it that way, that's it, right? We excise Castle, that's where we have the skip button. And then Fighting Talk, fantastic. And from there on out, it's just great, right? I mean, I have my reservations with the weepy bass solos, but other than that, it's a really good record. So
I know what you mean about the changes in the suite. They're pretty abrupt.
yeah,
I don't mind it, but
I like how they kind of introduced the different parts with the bells. I thought that was kind of neat.
yeah,
it is. I'm just saying, you know, it's almost like you can do all those things, but the transitions can be more thoughtful. That's all I'm saying. And these guys have the fucking talent to do it, right? So I think maybe they were just rushed. I don't know what the thinking was behind any of this, of course. I don't know any of it, but I find that it, given the level of talent and just how fucking great everything else is, these are little head scratchers for me. Like, why not spend 10 more minutes thinking of a better transition for that part, right? I don't know. I don't have an answer, but I love the record. I think ever since I bought it all those years ago, I've never stopped listening to it, and I've never gotten bored by it. So those are good things, right?
yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, this one didn't feel like homework. I really enjoyed.
Yeah.
Really wanted
We're
to
gonna
put
have to
it
get
back
you
on
to
and
hear
listen
it.
to it.
He has never heard it, but I'll hook him up.
Oh, you're in for a treat.
Yep.
Take a quick poll. What's your top track, Pete?
The Inquisition.
Ken?
Put it that way.
Eric?
Fighting Talk.
Chad?
I got to go with Put It That Way.
Chuck?
Fighting Talk.
Lewis?
I'm gonna go with Fighting Talk.
I'm the Inquisition. Love that song.
Yeah.
Great.
I love it too, but I keep thinking of Chick Corea's Spanish album, right? It's like that, but a little better, right? So that's what I mean. Like Fighting Talk is more about the muscle power that these guys bring, right?
They definitely do bring the muscle power. I mean, there's a good heft of rock in this album.
Yeah. Gary Moore is all about the, he brings in that,
So is that first album, is it singing all through?
Yeah.
All but one or two tracks.
All but one or
A lot of
two?
vocals.
Because I think that was another thing that I'd read about that they had the singer on the first record and got rid of him. And I found a lot of this very lyrical, like even War Dance, the keyboard motif that starts after the intro and the solo that Moore plays, that's, more like singing because he's not going crazy. He's playing more like a melody line. And then obviously as the song gets in, and that I feel like that happens a lot in a lot of these tracks that, before they really start blazing, there's that melody or hook that sticks in your head. And people have trouble with instrumentals, but these stuck with me too after a few listens. It didn't take long for this to sink in, I guess.
But really, is there a place in this music for a vocalist? I mean,
I don't know if I mean it that way, Ken, as much as I just thought the riffs or the melody lines that the guitar or the keyboard were playing were very catchy. But believe me, I keep the vocals out. I prefer it.
It was like I was saying, I'm thinking back to like when I used to go see Alan Holdsworth at IOU and he had Paul Williams. It was like the song was starting, Paul Williams would sing, and then he'd go off the stage,
disappear for a half hour.
Yeah, and then he'd come back for the next song and he'd start, and
But that seemed to be the thing, right? Like even the Dregs brought in Lickerwood or whatever his name was, and like they all seem to kind of we got to get a vocalist because we need radio play, and they never.
Yeah, the record labels were pushing that big time.
That's what I was saying, and that's what you hear, right? You hear this fucking vulture telling them, "You need this, you fucking need this," and they don't. The net contribution was the shittiest track here, right? That's what happened.
I want to mention one album that Gary Moore played on that I think was a fantastic record. I don't know if you guys. It was the album he did with Ginger Baker and Jack.
I own that record. It's great.
I love that record. I thought that was a brilliant album, and I would have loved to have seen them.
They wanted that to be Cream Part 2, and
it was.
Yeah.
It really was. It sounded like Cream Part 2. And they played, I think it was one show at the Marquee Club, and they got into a fist fight backstage, and that was it.
That was it. Yeah.
Shocking that Ginger Baker got into a fist fight, right?
Yeah.
He lived for that.
Yeah. But that was a great album. That was a great record.
It is.
And it's a shame because you could have seen that as like a jumping off point for somebody like a Gary Moore and a resurgence for Jack Bruce and Ginger Baker. It's like a resurrection of their careers.
Yeah, I think that wrong decade though.
Yes, it was the right band at the wrong time for sure.
For sure. Yeah.
As you mentioned before, Gary Moore just seemed to have been right behind everything. He was never at the forefront of everything. He was always at the back burner to everything.
He seemed to be. My impression always was that he was very difficult.
Yeah.
So,
was he? I don't know anything about him. He is Irish, correct?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
And he did have a drinking problem, and I'm not saying that because he was Irish. Just coincidentally, he also happened to have a drinking problem. Just for everybody who's going to be pissed, fuck you. I'm not saying that. But why? What? I never got the impression that he was difficult because he played with so many projects. Yeah. He had to hire people and do things. So
wasn't he in and out of Thin Lizzy?
Yeah, 4 times.
All by his own choosing, though.
Yep.
He just never wanted. I guess that he didn't feel like that was his band. I think in the end, he always really just wanted to be a solo band. Because quite frankly, he could have stuck around in Thin Lizzy, and I'm not saying they would have been any bigger with him than they were, but Thin Lizzy around parts of the world were a fairly big band. Not really much here.
Yep.
So would Gary Moore have been more of a household name if he would have stuck around in Thin Lizzy for 2, 3, 4 albums? Possibly. Would that have been the best thing for Thin Lizzy's career? Because I think they made a name for themselves with Gorham and Robertson doing the twin guitar thing there. And I think Gary Moore is, he doesn't, to me, he never came across as that guitar player who wanted to play with another guitar player. No, he was the guy.
Yeah, he was Blackmore type.
Yeah.
In a way.
So what's the best Thin Lizzy album to own? If you guys start with one, what's the one to have?
Johnny the Fox.
Johnny the Fox or Jailbreak.
Mm-hmm.
I actually like the Black Rose, and I like Thunder and Lightning.
Black Rose is great.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm unusual that way. I love Thunder and Lightning, although that's the John Sykes thing. I love Black Rose. I think that's with Gary Moore.
Mm-hmm.
How is Live and Dangerous?
Great.
Superb.
But also Gary recorded some of the stuff he did with Thin Lizzy in his solo records, right? Out in the Streets has Parisian Walkways and all these things as well, right? So they got along.
So he was always very close to Phil Lynott.
Yeah,
He
him
was
and
very
Phil,
close.
big friends.
You know, but just like what Pete said, he just always seemed to have wanted to do his own thing. I don't think that he really felt comfortable having a second guitar stepping over his lines. And I think that he had, but he even admitted himself. I think that his ego and his drinking problem had a lot of issues with him being in a band setting. But as he got older and so on, he started to mature, then he started realizing, like, listen, I'm doing my own thing and so on, I'm happy that way.
Well, he could certainly play enough notes for two people.
It's amazing that everyone's talking about Coliseum, but getting back to their early incarnation, where they were very much like a bluesish jazz rock band. Dick Hextall Smith was a great saxophone player. And then you have Dick Grinslide, or who was the keyboardist. And then you have
Chris Farlow's vocals, right?
Oh, superb, man. Oh, he was amazing. Still alive though. But still alive. But it was two totally different bands. If you guys listening to the jazz rock version of Coliseum II, and then you go back to that, you're like, oh, it's not the same, man. But I still loved it. Mm-hmm.
No, Coliseum, you hear a lot of
name was
Hammond
a pun. Do you think the name was a pun?
Which one?
Coliseum II, like saying this is still Coliseum.
No,
it could have been. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I always thought it was a weird thing. That
apparently John Heisman even cleared calling it that with all the members of the original band.
Oh, okay.
They wanted to call it Ghost, but then the management said, "Yeah, it's not good. That's not good for marketing." So that what do you talk about? Maybe bringing the Coliseum back.
Coliseum II is much better than Ghost.
Yeah.
Okie dokie.
All right. Well, I have an either or here. There's only two left that I'm looking at.
No, you got three. No, oh, no. Oh, Eric, did you pick one?
I got Zappa.
Oh, right. All right, you were the first. I'm sorry.
Chad or Lewis. I'll say since he was so prepared last time, I'll say let's have next one be Chad.
All right.
All righty.
All right.
Cool. Looking forward to hearing what that's going to be.
I got to go out and buy all these Rush albums.
Well, as long as it's not the Susie the Banshees, huh?
I
Guess we'll see in the chat tomorrow morning.
Yeah, exactly. However, I think before we do that episode, though, we have to review that In the Court of the Crimson King little movie documentary box set thing that came out. So I'm not sure how many of folks will be partaking in that, and maybe we do a bonus episode for that. But so we've got Chad's pick coming up. We've got the review of In the Court of the Crimson King documentary box set, whatever the hell you want to call it. And that'll keep us busy for the next couple of weeks. So thank you, George, for being the ringleader for this episode and giving us a really great album to sit and talk about, because I think this is pretty damn spectacular. I don't, and anytime I can sit and talk about Gary Moore, I'm a happy camper. So that's a BGO release, right, guys?
Yep.
Yes.
Of course, they do such a great job.
Yeah.
I've got the same copy that Lewis does. This is the one way records.
Yeah.
This
is mine.
Mine's esoteric. So I got a big book here.
Nice.
Oh wow, look at that.
Yeah.
I have it on cassette somewhere in the closet.
George, George,
I
when
have
did that esoteric version come out? Is that fairly recently?
Uh,
So I think it's that print.
2018,
It's that
Okay.
print.
Any extra tracks on it or just a straight album?
straight.
Ah.
It's got an extended version of Castles on it.
Wow. Where do I sign on that one? Huh?
Oh, gosh.
Take my money, please. All right, there you have it, everybody. So again, for those of you who have not heard Coliseum II's War Dance, you got some homework to do. Gary, get everybody in shape, get them in line, Principal Gary, and make sure everybody's got their homework assignment. And want to hear what you guys think about Coliseum II's War Dance album in the comments below. Till next time, visit us on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're on Facebook, we're on YouTube, all together.
All
the
damn time.
Time.
For George, Ken, Eric, Chad, Chuck, Lewis. Thanks for watching, everybody. That's right. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time here on In the Prog Seat. Have a good week, everybody. Bye-bye.